standing in front of a B-17. A B-17, it's known as the Flying Fortress, and there were 12,731 of these made. They earned their stars and stripes in World War II. In the 1930s, American aviation was really stuck on the aviation mechanics and technology from World War I, and things had to change. Air races became popular, and they were racing from California to Cleveland, Ohio. The winner of the 1931 air race was Major Jimmy Doolittle. Jimmy Doolittle became a general after he earned his promotions for the raid on Tokyo, Japan in April of 1942 when he took off from the USS Hornet. They took off with a dozen B-29 bombers.
Doolittle's plane is first down the runway, the commander leading the flight. As the carrier plows through heavy seas, one bomber after another soars from the flight deck, pointed for Japan.
Jimmy Doolittle led the raid from the USS Hornet in April of 1942. They bombed mainland Japan, and from that he became promoted. In 1931, Jimmy Doolittle flew from Burbank, California. He won the cross-country race, flying in an airplane that was known as a Super Solution, but it was a biplane. He flew at 223 miles an hour. And when he got to Cleveland at the National Air Races, my father was a 10-year-old boy, and he picked my father up and put him in the seat of his airplane. And my father told that story throughout his whole life. It was one of his proudest moments, meeting General Doolittle and getting to sit in his plane. But aviation began to change in the 1930s. In 1935, President Roosevelt wanted a new airplane, wanted a new bomber. And the result of his orders, and the result of his request to Congress, for $300 million to purchase 3,000 of these B-17s was the plane you see behind me. The first plane was the B-299. Only one model was made of that, and after 40 hours of flight, it eventually crashed. But the plane kept going through innovations, evolutions, development, and new models. The B-17A, the B-17B, E, F, G. They kept improving the plane, putting more armaments, more bomb payloads, bigger engines, but they never really improved the comfort on the inside. England bought several of these airplanes after Adolf Hitler invaded Poland. When Hitler invaded Poland, 2 days after Hitler invaded Poland, England and France declared war on Germany. After about 8 or 9 months, the French surrendered. But with the help of these B-17s, Churchill ordered the bombing of Germany. And of course that infuriated Adolf Hitler. So Hitler was bombing England in June of 1940. But after the Royal Air Force struck Germany, Hitler began to bomb London itself. That's where one of my favorite recording artists got her start, Petula Clark. She entertained the people in the subways, what they call the Tube in London, because everybody sought refuge during the nighttime from the bombing raids from Hitler's Luftwaffe. She sang in these tubes and entertained the troops when she was only 8 years old. She was born in 1932, and this was 1940. In June of 1940, the bombing began, and they bombed London starting on September the 6th of 1940 for 66 straight nights. They took one night off. They used the fires that they set as guideposts to find their way because everything was a blackout. There were no lights, there was nothing. There was no way for them to navigate other than the fires that the bombs had started. This B-17 is 73 feet from the nose to the tail. On the nose you can see there's 50 millimeter machine guns. They were operated by everybody on the plane, including the navigator. The navigator, this is the door the navigator used to bail out. We're going to visit with Dr. Hansler in a few minutes, and when it came time to bail out, he jumped out of a door exactly like this over Poland, who was a 20-year-old navigator on this plane, a plane identical to this that got shot down over German-occupied Poland in 1944. When this plane took off, these tires got to be 4.5 feet high. They retracted forward underneath the plane, and it exposed, of course, what they called blisters. The blister was a gun turret. They had gun turrets up front, 50 millimeter machine guns up front, 50 millimeter machine guns underneath, 50 millimeter machine guns on top, and in the tail section. And when the crew members weren't doing their job, such as dropping bombs or navigating, they manned the machine guns. This plane flew with as few crew members as possible. That's why they were so successful. They dropped 640,000 tons of bombs over Germany during World War II. This plane had machine guns all around the plane. There were machine guns in turrets called blisters beneath the plane, on top of the plane, on the side of the plane. They were called waist guns because they were halfway from the front to the back, roughly the waistline of the fuselage. Okay, we got a good look at the B-17s. They called it the Flying Fortress for a real good reason. B-17. There's 33 bombs painted on the side of this B-17. That's for the 33 bombing missions that this plane flew over Europe. The B-17 didn't fly much in the Pacific theater of war because it didn't have a long range, and it took a long throw to get from island to island in the Pacific, and they couldn't waste all that gas just to get there without using gas for the bombing mission. So they were mostly used in Europe during World War II. This plane is absolutely amazing. Just to imagine the fact that this thing even got off the ground, and this plane was flying over Germany, flying over France, any occupied territory by the Germans in World War II. This plane was used to bomb them. The number of bombing missions for each one of these planes, the damage that it did during World War II to stop Hitler's factories, to stop his shipping lanes, to stop the battleships from leaving the ports, to stop Hitler's development of the V-2 rocket. The 50 millimeter machine gun fire that was coming out of that turret to protect this plane. The 50 millimeter machine gun fire that was coming out of this gun, the waist gun above my head here. The plane is flying at about 300 miles an hour, and it's being attacked by the German fighter planes, which were sent up there to stop these bombers from carrying out their missions. The bombers had to be able to protect themselves. They armored this plane over the course of the war. They continually made it safer and put more armament, making the plane heavier, which is why the plane needed more and more horsepower out of those engines. But it worked, and it worked well. It's been said that if we didn't have the B-17s, we wouldn't have won the war in Europe. We wouldn't have been successful in D-Day invasion of Normandy Beach in France. On the back of the plane, there was a turret with 50 millimeter machine guns. The plane had to protect itself. It always didn't have protection from the P-51 Mustangs. The Tuskegee Airmen. It was their job to protect these bombers so they could complete their missions. But they always weren't there. There were other missions that P-51s had to undertake. So sometimes these planes were alone in the sky. There were times when there were 1,000 of these B-17s on a mission over German-occupied Europe. Think of the responsibility of the man sitting in the tail gun. We have to remember, back in 1944, there was no Air Force. This was the Army Air Corps. There wasn't an Air Force until Harry Truman changed that September of 1947, when he created both the CIA and the Air Force. The aerodynamics of this plane just amazes me. This is 1935, and we've come a long way from the Wright brothers, which was only 32 years before this plane. Man had only been airborne for 32 years when they developed this flying fortress. It's absolutely amazing. This really makes us appreciate what our fathers and grandfathers did in World War II. There are so few of them left, but we're going to get to go meet with one in a few minutes. His name is Richard Hansler. Dr. Hansler flew in an aircraft identical to this, flew 25 missions over German-occupied Europe. And on his 25th mission, he was shot down. 20 years old. I want to hear his story, and I want you to come with me, because he is a real American hero. That B-17 that we just looked at is identical to the B-17 that this man was flying in back in 1944 when he was shot down over Poland. This is Dick Hansler. This is the man I've been telling you about. He's an American war hero, a young man who joined the Army Air Corps fresh out of college back in 1943. Or was it 1944?
43 is right.
Okay. I'm just going to take that out of there then. Back in 1943. Dick, tell me, what were you doing before you entered the war? What did you know about what was happening during the war? Did it affect you?
Well, I was very concerned when Hitler went into Poland, and that, of course, meant that we were going to all end up in the service, which I did finally when I enlisted in the Army Air Corps, and it was a decision that turned out to be a very good one.
Now, back in 1939, when Hitler invaded Poland, you were only 15 years old.
Right.
And you were in high school back in Minnesota. Which city were you living in?
Actually, in Milwaukee.
Oh, I'm sorry. Back in 1939, when Hitler invaded Poland, you were in high school in Milwaukee. And what were the kids talking about? Because I can remember being 15 years old in high school. We were talking about sports. We were talking about Cleveland Indians, talking about the Cleveland Browns, talking about our high school sports in our school. But we were not involved in a world war. Vietnam was going on, but it was not a world war like what was happening in Europe. How did it affect you? What did your friends have to say to you?
Well, I think we were pretty fatalistic about it. I think we all realized that it was something that, although the U.S. wasn't involved directly at that time, I think we all knew that we were going to end up in the service in one fashion or another.
And nobody could have imagined, of course, Pearl Harbor. So you weren't looking at a war with Japan at that time.
No, we weren't. It was all about Germany and Hitler.
Yeah. So 15, 16-year-old kids talking about Adolf Hitler over in Europe, what he's doing. So you finish high school, you graduated. Do you remember the year you graduated from high school?
I do remember that it was an event that we all enjoyed a lot because we had a wonderful experience in high school, had a lot of friends, and enjoyed life immensely. And it was somewhat of an idea that let's eat, drink, and be happy because tomorrow we'd probably be in the service.
All right, this is now 1942. So when you graduated in the summer of 42, you went to college?
I went to the University of Wisconsin in Milwaukee, where I majored in physics.
Physics?
And
Now wait a minute. I mean, who majors in physics? Everybody, we did, we majored in other things, sociology, philosophy, history, things, but physics. Were you a scientist as a kid? Were you?
I was a scientist as a kid. I did a lot of photography. I developed my own pictures. I was into crystal set radio, shortwave radio, where we would try to see how far away we could, from South America or all over the world, you could pick up stations that broadcast during the night. And that fascinated me.
You were a geek.
I was a geek,
A
right?
geek back in 42. I didn't know they had geeks in 42. We got our first geek. Okay. So as a geek in 42, did your friends think that your interest in this kind of thing was unusual?
No, because we were a bunch of geeks.
Uh-oh.
My best buddy and I had a darkroom together on the third floor of his house. So, yeah, we shared a lot of interests. And the physics got me because I had had a very good science teacher in high school, Mr. Raisin, and he pretty much inspired me to get interested in science and physics. So that was why I majored in physics.
Right, so now you're pursuing this physics in your first year of college. But what happened? Because you ended up in the Army Air Corps.
Well, at the end of the semester, I decided I was going to get drafted. Why don't I go and volunteer to the Army Air Corps? Which is, after I talked it over with my parents, decided that's what I should do. My brother had already enlisted in the Navy, and so I decided that we didn't both want to be in the same service, and the Air Force sounded good to me.
Right now, Air Force, airplanes. Had you had any experience with flying before this?
Not really. I had no, other than model airplanes, that was the extent of my knowledge.
So when you got into the Army Air Corps, what did you expect to be doing?
I thought I'd like to be a pilot, but when we got to the place where they did the tests to find out if you were qualified for a particular job, they decided that because I was good in math, that I had studied physics, and that my eyes were too close together to be a good pilot. I didn't have very good depth perception, that maybe navigator would be a good choice for me.
So you found yourself, first you had to go through a basic training.
Right.
Where was that?
In Shepherd Field in Texas.
Which is now Shepherd Air Force Base.
Probably, yeah.
Yeah. But back then it was just a field because we didn't have that many planes. We didn't even have an Air Force. Their airplanes were part of the Army Air Corps. Mm-hmm. And it wasn't until after the war that Harry Truman changed all that and created the Air Force.
Right.
But before he did that, you were a soldier like all the other soldiers, only you were around planes. You're learning about planes, and you knew then that you're going to get in one of these machines and be flying?
Yeah.
And that was something you wanted to do?
It was something I was trained to do, and it seemed like we were eager to get done with the training and on to the real thing.
Now, getting eager to be up in the air over in Europe also meant that the Germans are going to be trying to bring you down. They're going to be trying to shoot at your plane, whatever plane you were going to be in, and make it crash. But you were still eager to be up there and do that job.
Well, we didn't really think a whole lot about it. We just knew that we had a job to do, and it was an important job, and we needed to get to it.
So after your training at Shepherd, what happened to you then?
Well, we went through some more training before we actually got our own airplane, but that was an exciting time when we actually got a brand new airplane for us to take to Europe.
Where were you when you received the airplane?
We were in Kearney, Nebraska, where we got our new airplane.
When you say we, this is this crew that was composed by the Army, and they said, now we're going to get you guys a new airplane, and you're going to take this airplane to Europe.
Correct.
Okay, here's your plane, brand new flying machines. It's got 4 engines. It's a big plane. It's a bomber. So they're going to put bombs in this, and you're going to fly over the targets, and you're going to drop the bombs.
Yep.
What was your job?
My job was to make sure we got to the right place at the right time. As a navigator, that's the responsibility you have. And you do it several different ways. We learned to do both what they call pilotage, where you just look at the ground and know where you are on that basis. But I also was trained in doing celestial navigation, which is where you navigate by the stars. But I never had to do anything of that sort. Only thing I used my astronomical abilities was when we flew the plane from Gander, Newfoundland to the Azores Islands. And there we had to go by day, and the only question was, were we on course? And what I did is what they call shooting the sun. Measure the elevation of the sun above the horizon at noon, celestial time, and from that you can calculate your latitude. That's all I care about. I didn't care when I got there. I just wanted to make darn sure I got there, the little speck of an island in the middle of the ocean.
And all you can see is water.
Right.
Water and water. Now the pilot and the co-pilot, they're just flying this plane where you tell them to go.
Right.
So they're trusting you,
Absolutely.
as is the other 9 guys on that plane. Your position was what? Right behind the pilot?
Right in front of the pilot.
In front of the pilot.
There's a little room in the front of the plane where the bombardier and the navigator sit, and they were actually below the feet of the pilot and co-pilot.
How did you talk to him? Did you just yell to him, or?
No, we had intercom.
Yeah, it was pretty noisy up there.
Yeah, you had to have earphones and microphone.
Yeah. And what about comforts up there? Was it comfortable? Did you have a nice cushy environment?
Not exactly. We were flying at very high altitude, up to 25,000 feet, like 5 miles about. And it's very cold up there, and we didn't have any heat. What we had was nice warm clothing and heavy boots.
Bundle up.
Yep.
Gloves.
And
boots,
we had to
hats.
wear an oxygen mask and a helmet and with earphones and a microphone built into the thing. So it was quite a thing getting ready to go up there.
You're 20 years old, and these other guys are roughly the same age, and you're flying in this big airplane. It's a B-17, and it had a nickname.
Flying Fortress.
And it was a fortress, wasn't it?
Yep. Got a pair of guns for everybody on the crew. There are 10 people on the crew, and we have 20 guns.
So, not just navigating, but you've got a 50-millimeter machine gun.
Right.
You've got to be pumping out all those bullets when the time came. And I'm sure that you had to use it during all your flying missions.
Actually, the only time I had actually fire my gun at a plane was the day we got shot down.
The day you got shot down. Now, before we talk about your last ride, let's talk about your first ride. Do you remember that? That was what?
It was memorable because on the way out of the supply house where we stored our equipment, my oxygen mask got caught on the shelf above where the bag was and got pulled out of my bag and left behind. So I flew my first mission without any oxygen mask. And that was pretty exciting because I had to suck on this oxygen hose and have to remember to do that because I'd forget because I'd start losing consciousness.
So the mask you didn't have, but you had the hose from the oxygen supply.
Right,
So you would periodically suck on that and get back to work.
right.
Wow. Did the other crew know that you were
Yeah,
that
they
close
kept
to,
their eyes on me
I
because
would
without
say so.
oxygen you get pretty flaky after a while.
And with you being flaky, they didn't know where to go.
Well, fortunately, we were flying a formation, and they, in the formation flying, the lead navigator is in charge.
Okay.
The other navigators are more or less there in case you get separated or.
So this is in July of 1944. July 22nd, I believe, was your first mission.
I think that's right.
Now this is just 1 month after the D-Day invasion.
Mm-hmm.
I'm sure that your mission is then to support those soldiers that came ashore at Normandy.
That isn't quite correct. We did mostly what they call strategic bombing, which we bombed sources of gasoline. We bombed the factories where they made tanks. We more or less were the ones that were knocking out Hitler's ability to wage war.
Well, then that sounds to me like you're supporting those guys who have come ashore so that they're not met with more guns and more armaments, so that their task is a little bit safer, a little bit easier.
Exactly.
Okay, so you're doing these bombing missions, and if I remember correctly, there's one particular day when you had to do 3 missions in one day.
You're remembering better than I do.
Oh, I wasn't there, so I'm not really remembering it. I'm remembering it from your book.
Oh, I see.
And you wrote a book about what you did.
I did.
And the name of the book is Prepare to Bail Out.
Right. Those were the words that our co-pilot said when we made the decision that we had to give up on going back home.
But that was on your 25th mission. But the 24 missions before that were all rather successful. Because you did have a safe landing after every mission.
Right.
Now, every one of these missions resulted in you and your bombing crew hitting the target.
That's almost true. We had one mission where the whole squadron's bombs missed the target.
Let me stop you right there. Okay. Now this is the book that we were talking about. This is the book that you wrote. In writing this book, this is basically a diary.
Right. I wrote almost all of that right after I got back. So it was almost, I still had very clear memory of what all had happened.
Well, every day that went by was crystal clear in your mind.
Pretty much, yeah.
Yeah. So you could recall everybody's name, because the names of the people, the identities, the locations, the times, the dates, everything is in here.
Mm-hmm.
So you were telling me that out of the 24 missions hitting the target, only one was a little bit off target.
Right, that was where we were bombing submarine pens in Genoa, Italy.
Hitler had these U-boats off the coast, right there in Genoa, Italy.
Right.
And it was your job to knock out the subs or knock out the port.
Right.
How'd you do?
We missed.
You missed.
And we got chewed out royally.
Well, I don't blame him. I mean, we're giving you all these bombs and you missed. What'd you hit? Just
We
one?
hit the Adriatic Ocean, or
You hit the
whatever
Adriatic
it's
Sea.
called.
Well, you wasted a few bombs. But
Right.
I'm sure you came back eventually. They gave you more, and you went back and did another mission.
I think we did. I don't recall for certain, but I think we did bomb there again.
From what I've read, though, we won the war. So it sounds like everything eventually came out okay.
For us, it did.
So there was one mission, and this is in September. Is it September 13th?
Correct.
And this is 1944.
Right.
So there's June, July, August, September. We're getting into the 4th month now after the D-Day invasion. We've got hundreds of thousands of troops coming over from England across the English Channel, and they're basically all over Europe, and they're fighting with the Germans. They're moving east towards Germany. Germany's trying to confront them, and they've got Russia coming from the other direction, and they've got guys like you bombing coming up from the south. But what happened on that 25th mission?
Well, unfortunately, right after we dropped our bombs, there was this huge explosion. We think it was the fact that flak, the German artillery, actually detonated our bombs right after we dropped them. And
You mean in the air?
Yeah.
Okay, you let these bombs go from the bomb bay,
Right.
and before they get too far from the plane, they're hit by incoming fire from the Germans.
Right. Correct.
Oh, and that created an explosion. You got bombed by your own bombs,
Absolutely.
and that damaged your plane.
Yeah, it did a big job on us. It knocked out two of our engines. It blew big holes in the wings, blew off the plastic nose of the airplane. It bent the I-beam that goes down the length of the airplane, knocked out our oxygen, knocked out our radio. Fortunately, none of the crew were injured, except for the bombardier who, when I looked at him, one of his goggles was shattered, and when I lifted up his goggles, his eye was bloody, not horrible, but it was bloodshot, and he had got some scrap of his glasses, I suppose, that got into his eyes. And anyway, he was in pain. But despite that pain, when we got jumped by German fighters, he went back to his position at this turret where two guns are mounted. It's right in the front of the plane. He got in position and started firing, and there was a plane coming toward us, and we could see the tracer's bullets going out, and they were a little bit low, and he raised it a little bit and shot into this German fighter plane, and we saw it flip over, and we learned that the pilot never got out. So we knocked down one of the Germans. The other one kept fighting, kept coming at us. But that was when I got to fire my gun at this other plane, but we never hit him. And that was about the time we had this conference to decide whether we could make it back to Italy. So I looked at my charts and determined that we were north of the Carpathian, the Alps. We were already at a lower altitude because we had to get down because we didn't have any oxygen. And we determined that we were losing altitude, and my advice to the pilot was that there was no probability that we could get back to our base. And after discussing with the other crew members, the pilot decided that we should bail out. And the co-pilot got on the intercom and said, "Prepare to bail out."
Prepare to bail out, and that's how we arrive here.
Title of my book came from.
This plane can't fly any longer. I gotta jump out of this thing?
We had been trained to land, once when you land from a parachute, you're still going pretty fast. So they trained us to jump off this platform, which simulated how fast you would land. So we learned to land and roll to avoid breaking our legs. And so we had that training, but we didn't have any training actually jumping out of the airplane. I wasn't too worried about that because to stay was no option.
Right, you didn't have a choice.
There was no choice.
You go over to this door, and I believe the door was in front of the wing, below the fuselage,
Right.
towards the bottom. Mm-hmm. Not a real big door. I looked at that door.
I looked at that door. It's right next to the propeller.
Yeah. So, okay, I got to do this. Here I go.
Right.
What'd you do?
Just went out head first. I told the bombardier to go first, but he said no, so I went.
When you went, was everybody else out of the plane yet, or were they all jumping out the
They
doors?
were all jumping about. Well, there was no longer any communication. The intercom had gone out. Our brave co-pilot went through the whole plane way back to the tail gunner and to the ball gunner and made sure that they got out. The pilot, I think, was the last to jump.
You find yourself now in the air, and they're still shooting. There's still firing going on.
There's still that one plane that had been attacking us. I decided that we had heard that sometimes the German pilots would fire on the crew members that were hanging in a parachute. It's against the Geneva Convention to do that, but they did it anyhow. So I was afraid they might shoot at us because we had shot down one of the planes, and so I delayed opening my chute till I was close to the ground. And
So you kept your chute closed as long as you could,
right,
so that you wouldn't become a target.
exactly.
When you realized the ground is getting awfully close, I'd better pull the cord, you did it. Bang! It almost ripped you in half.
Yeah, it's quite a shocking thing. When it opens, you stop dropping pretty rapidly. Fortunately, my chute opened nicely and it was not tangled up or anything. And so I landed safely and didn't break my leg or anything when I landed.
How far do you think you fell, free fall?
Not terribly long because we had gone down to lower altitude. We were probably at 3,000 to 5,000 feet, something like that, which is not very high.
So you fell a little over half a mile.
Right.
All right, and then you see the ground coming awfully fast, and then you pull the cord, and you begin to float.
For a little while, I thought maybe I had died and gone to heaven because it was such a peaceful, I mean, it was completely quiet, and had been all this noise of the air coming in that open nose where the nose had been blown off. And so out of that chaos, it was now completely quiet, and I was surrounded by this pastoral scene of southern Poland, and it was very beautiful. And so I thought, well, maybe I died and went to heaven.
But you soon learned that you weren't going to land in heaven.
Right.
So you land near the border between Poland and Czechoslovakia.
Correct. It was actually on what was then Slovakia, but after the war it became Poland again, which is what had been, it was called Jablanka, the name of the nearest village. And that was, as I say, in Czechoslovakia at that time, but is now back in Poland.
You hit the ground and you go, where am I? I don't know anybody here, don't have any friends, any family, so I'd better do what I can to save my life.
Right. I knew that the Germans would be looking for us, and that was very true. And 5 of the crew members were captured that day by the Germans. But the rest of us, the other 5, all managed to hide out that day and to avoid capture.
You had to gather in your chute, because if you left the chute just sitting there, it was kind of like a marker.
Right.
As a giveaway sign as to where these guys landed. So you brought in your chute, and you looked around and you said, which way do I go? Which way do I walk?
There were some farm people there, peasants, that were very welcoming, and I gave my chute to one of them, and she seemed to be grateful. Probably ended up as clothing for some of the children or women. And they invited me into the house and gave me something to drink. And I showed them, I had a New Testament that had a picture of a flag in a U.S. flag, and I showed that to them. And they right away knew that I was an American, and were very welcoming.
Now they take you into their house, but that put them at risk.
Right.
Where'd you stay? Did you sit in the living room? Did you sleep in the beds? Where did you
Well,
go at night?
actually what I did was to decide to try to hide from the Germans because I figured they'd be looking for me. So I went into this woods that was near where I landed and just spent the rest of the day in that woods. And that is, when darkness came, I went to the edge of the woods where there was a road and saw this guy coming along with a cart, and he was actually looking for me and I was looking for him, and we didn't have very good communications, but he pretty much indicated that I should hide under the whatever was in that cart, and so I hid under whatever was there, and he took me to his home, and that was then where I spent the first night. The next day, the Germans were looking for, because they were going house to house. He came and said, you have to move. And he took me to a house further up the hill. And I stayed there then until after the Germans had searched the first house. And after they had gone through there, then I went back to the first house when they went and checked the house I had been in during the day.
Did you ever hear any German voices?
Not that day I didn't, but on one other occasion, Germans came in the front door of a house where I had spent the night. At the same time, I went out the back door, and so that was a close call. But
You can hear them speaking. That means that they're very close, and at any second they could discover you.
right.
And that could be the end of Dick Hansler.
Hmm.
But as luck would have it, you survived.
Yeah, I was very lucky and very grateful. All these people that risked their lives in order to help protect me. I felt a deep debt of gratitude to them.
And they ushered you through a series of other people's houses, always staying a step ahead or a step behind where the Germans were searching so that they never saw you.
Correct.
Now your 5 other crewmates did the same thing.
Similar stories, yeah.
And you eventually met up with some of them.
Hmm. Yeah, the 5 that survived and went with, we actually, after that first day or two, we got together, the other 4 members, and they asked us, they actually suggested, we were now in Slovakia, and so we overnight went into Poland, where we then joined up with the Polish Underground Army. And that was where we spent the rest of the war.
Doing what?
Pretty much just hanging out and...
Being on the alert for Germans.
Right, we would stand guard at night to make sure that we weren't going to get surprised by the Germans coming up the hill. We were halfway up the mountain, and the Germans didn't go into the mountains very often because when they did, they oftentimes didn't come back again because the partisans were in the mountains and
When you say
were
partisans,
ambushed.
you're talking about the Polish underground people.
Right,
And every opportunity they had to kill the Germans, they took it.
right.
And of course, the Germans also had to worry about the Russians who were marching towards Berlin. So you are doing this now, and you don't know how long you're going to have to do this. You don't know how long, if success is ever going to come.
Well, we tried to, there was a radio contact between the partisan, the Polish underground, and a group in Italy. And by way of that radio, we contacted our group in Italy and said, come and get us. And they said, we'll find a field where we can land and we'll come and pick you up. So that became our assignment, was to then find a field that would be suitable for a plane to come in and
What kind of
land.
a plane were they going to land?
Probably a C-3 or one of the other. That wasn't really part of our thinking. It was most any field that would be suitable for an airplane.
Anything flat, anything with enough room.
Right, long enough straight area that would not be too soft that the plane would get mired down or something.
And did it happen? Did you find a field?
We did find a field, and we sent the coordinates to Italy, but then nothing happened. They didn't send in anybody. We're not sure that the message ever got through because I think the partisans kind of liked our being there in the sense that the Allied forces would drop supplies to the Polish underground, weapons and food and all kinds of things, and that kept them going. So we thought maybe they weren't really too interested in our getting out of there because they were taking care of us, and that helped them as far as their political impact with the Allies.
You're being well cared for.
Right,
The war is progressing. Do you know the war is progressing and it's going well?
right. We used to listen to the BBC. That was one of the benefits of this radio. We could keep track of what was happening with our forces in Europe.
And you're finding then that in the spring of 1945 that they are making progress towards Berlin, and that from both sides Hitler's Third Reich is finally getting squeezed.
Right.
But you can go nowhere. You're just sitting tight.
Well, the Russian front actually came through in the spring of 45, came through where we were, and the Polish people were not very happy about that because they were as much afraid of the Russians as of the Germans.
Well, Russia took half of Poland, that half that Germany gave to them, until Germany declared war on Russia and took it all.
Right.
So the Polish didn't know really who to trust other than the Americans.
Right. So we, once the front came through, we decided that would be our way out of there. That was one of the times I had a pretty close call. This British fellow who had escaped from a prison camp and had joined our group, he and I went together to see if we could make contact with the Russians, and we were fairly quickly picked up by a couple of Russian soldiers who took us to their local headquarters, which was in a school building. And
Are you wearing a uniform at this time?
I was not. I had it, well, I was and I wasn't. I had part of my uniform so that I was afraid if I didn't look like an American.
Yeah.
But you couldn't really tell from looking at us that we were Americans because when you're flying, you don't really have on a full uniform. So anyway, we got there, this sergeant that was in charge of this headquarters thought I was a German and was going to execute me on the spot. And he was pretty drunk, and he offered me a drink, my final drink, you know, as they do in the movies. And he pulled out his pistol and put it on this table where we were sitting, and he poured me a glass of Bimba, I think it was, that we were drinking, and we each drank, and then he was going to march me out and back and shoot me. And as we started to leave to do that,
You mean you actually got up from the table and were heading out to the back
Right.
to be shot?
and at that point, the corporal that was working on a truck outside, he was sober, and I think he recognized that I was an American. He talked the sergeant out of shooting me. So that was one of the close calls that I had.
Close, you say? I would say so. Well, we look back now and laugh.
Right.
But at the time,
At the time, it was fairly serious.
yeah, you fairly serious. Yeah, you were just moments away from ending the life history of Dick Hansler.
Well, I don't know what I would have done, whether I would have, since the guy was drunk, I probably would have tried to take his gun from him. And
You weren't going to cooperate with him, of course not.
I was not going to
No.
simply,
No. But still, just the fact that this guy had decided to execute you, and there was only one gun in that place, and he had it,
right,
the odds were against you.
right.
But you got the reprieve, and you were recognized as being an American soldier.
Hmm.
Everything's okay now?
Everything's okay. We went back and got the rest of our group. By then, it was a very large group. B-24 crew had been shot down, and they had joined us. And we had several people that had escaped from prisoner of war camp. So we had a pretty big bunch, and so we all got together and came, and the Russians then didn't know quite what to do with us. So for the first few days, we simply followed the front, and it was pretty bloody. I mean, we saw the results of the kind of warfare that was going on.
So the Russians are continuing to march through the German lines.
Right,
Battle's going on.
right,
But you're not engaging in battle because you don't have any weapons.
Right.
You really don't have any equipment or proper clothing. So you're just with them,
right.
and you're watching this.
Yeah, we're just staying with them in order to, we were under their control, and we didn't want to get away from that because who knows what would have happened to us.
Yeah, I mean, you had no way to protect yourselves.
Right,
And if the Germans did find you, of course, you'd be shot by them. So you're marching along with the Russian movement. And when does the end come? When does it, all this pressure, all this stress, all this fear, finally be over?
well, as we were traveling with the Russians, they got a truck for us and decided to send us east, away from the front. And for a couple days we rode in this truck, and it was the middle of the winter and very cold, and we had poor clothing, and so I got sick and ended up with pneumonia, ended up in a Russian field hospital where I spent 6 weeks recovering from the pneumonia. That was before penicillin, and the only treatment I got really was a glass of red wine right after lunch, and I'd sleep all afternoon and sweat a lot. And after 6 weeks, I felt much better.
So you're a little stronger now, and we're getting closer to the end of the war. So when does the end of the war come to you? When do you learn that this is over? We're successful here in Europe.
Well, they put us on a ship out of Odessa and took us back to Naples.
Odessa's in Russia.
Right.
So they take you back into Russian territory.
I take a train down to Odessa from the city where I'd been in the hospital, and they sent in a ship and took us on this ship back to Naples, Italy. And from there I was put on a plane and got back to the U.S. that way.
So were you in the U.S. when the war ended in Europe?
Yes.
Is that where you heard the news?
Yes, I think so. I'm not 100% sure about that. I don't remember it real clearly, so I think maybe I wasn't. I don't recall any big celebration, which did happen in most places in the U.S. I probably was still in Naples.
So you come back now, we did our job, we won this war, but it's still continuing in the Pacific.
Right.
Some of the guys that thought the war was over and that they were finally going to go home were shipped over to the Pacific.
My brother was one of them. He was in the Navy, and he had been in on D-Day in Europe, and when that was over, he got shipped to the Pacific, where he got involved in some of the action over there.
And not only some of the action, but some of the planning, because it was planned that they were going to eventually have to invade Japan.
Right.
But then Harry Truman went to Potsdam in July. While he was there, he learned about the success of the A-bomb test, and he said immediately, drop it. We've got to end this war. If that's what it takes, we've got to use the atomic bomb.
Right.
And they dropped it. Where were you when you heard the news about the atomic bomb?
Okay, I was back in Milwaukee at that time. I was delighted to hear that my brother would be able to definitely come home now without having to invade Japan.
Yeah. So they dropped the bomb. 3 days later, they dropped the second bomb, which is a little bit different from the first bomb. This is based upon hydrogen. And that, of course, at Nagasaki, the Japanese said, no more. Okay. We'll talk about unconditional surrender. And they did. And of course, just a few weeks later, they surrendered aboard the USS Missouri. It's all over. Now, you earned your stripes. War's over. How do you feel about contributing to the success of the American venture in going over there and saving Europe?
Well, I was very happy that we had been successful in what we tried to do. So I took a little bit of pride in having been involved in that, but overall I became pretty much of a pacifist simply because I saw how fragile democracy is and how wars don't really solve problems. They simply, I mean, we certainly got rid of Hitler, but one of the discouraging things was when I was with the Polish people, some of the Polish army guys would make comments like, well, Hitler was bad, but at least he got rid of the Jews. And for a Polish person to say that was really surprising because compared to the Jews, the Polish people have been discriminated against throughout history, probably almost as much as the Jews. And so, you know, wars don't settle that sort of thing.
It's interesting to hear your perspective in that way, because we look at it as, okay, we wiped out the Nazis and we saved Europe and maybe the rest of the world from Nazi domination. But you're glad to see the war end, of course. You're glad to see that the United States won, but what you're saying is that the war didn't really solve all the problems that the celebrations pretended like it did.
Right.
And there's a lot of more, obviously there's a lot more work to do.
Yeah, wars never really end, in my opinion. I mean, we're still fighting World War II in a sense. That the German elections just last week, the neo-Nazi party, the far-right party, got enough votes to 15% of the vote or something like that, which that's disturbing that they would be that popular. It's not been that long, 70-some years, that they've already forgotten how horrible Hitler was.
And when you talk about wars never really ending, you know, the Civil War in this country, you take your age and add my age to it, and we're back to the time of the Civil War.
Mm-hmm.
And when you drive across that Mason-Dixon line and go down through Virginia and go down to North Carolina and South Carolina, you see so much evidence of that Civil War.
Right.
It's not really over. So there's a lot more work to do.
A lot more work to do. That's why we need historians to remind us.
That's why we can never forget the past. And I always enjoy what I call the opportunity to sit with somebody like you and reach back and touch that past. That was 70 years ago for you.
Right.
But it's still in your memory. It's still a part of your past, part of your history, and it's a part of our history. So for that reason, of course, we appreciate hearing what you as a 20-year-old boy, really, you weren't even a young man at the time, but the war certainly made you into a young man because it changed your whole perspective on life.
Yeah, one of the things that certainly I should mention in this interview is the Tuskegee Airmen. They provided cover for us when we were on our bombing runs. The fighter planes manned by the Tuskegee Airmen provided cover for us to protect us from the German fighter planes. So we were really delighted when they would show up, and we were aware that this was a group of black men that were manning those airplanes, and their whole group was not very far from us. They were stationed in Italy, not too far from us. And sometimes they would fly over at very low altitude just for the fun of it, scare the heck out of us. They'd go at 50 feet above the ground. They'd come 300, 600 miles an hour, however fast they would go, and scare the heck out of us with this blast of sound and fury. It would make the tent flaps flap.
Those P-51 Mustangs they had.
They were the ones that were flying most of the time, also the P-38s. So we saw these guys, and we really appreciated that they were there, and that had a big impact on my thoughts about race, because up until then I hadn't really paid any attention to it. And when I came back to the States and saw the way that the black servicemen in the States were being treated, you know, they could only pick up the garbage and clean the latrines and couldn't even go into the PX or into the rec rooms, or they were treated as like dirt, and that had a big impact on my thoughts about race relations.
And you don't even know how many times they saved your life up in the
We
air.
never know that, right?
And what they did was, at times they flew with you, they flew around you, above you and below you, but at times they went on ahead, and they engaged the Luftwaffe
Right.
in front of you to make the way safer, so
Right.
that you could fly through and complete your missions. And you never knew really how many times they risked their lives, or even some of them lost their lives, so that Dick Hansler and his crew and his B-17 flew a safe and successful mission.
Right.
So you owe to them people you don't even know.
I was so pleased that Maurice Newman arranged for the meeting, Asa and also Richardson, who was those are the two Cleveland area Tuskegee Airmen still alive today. And I had a chance to meet with them last week and
Yeah, that was
say
pleasant.
thank you.
Yeah, that was Ace's 99th birthday party.
Yeah, that was very nice.
I thank you for taking the time to sit and talk to us and let other people who are going to hear this understand what you went through and to learn and appreciate what you did.
Well, I thank you for the opportunity to interview about this. I again share the view that we have to keep track of what's happened in the past in order to avoid the mistakes that we made then, and not simply keep making them over and over again.
So should I shake your hand or salute you?
Just let me thank you.
Okay, buddy. I appreciate it. Thanks very much.